So we talked a little bit previously in a couple of previous lectures about how you structure your Photoshop files and organizing your layers in Photoshop, and keeping yourself organized is absolutely critical. And I talked about this also in one of the video lectures, but I want to cover it again here a little more with a little more emphasis. Keeping a kind of a root folder for each of your projects is really helpful. What I usually recommend is, say, make a folder for web design, and then inside that folder have a folder for each project. And that folder is your root folder for each of those projects. Now, you computing people are familiar with the concept of a root folder or root directory, and I'm just kind of treating it the same way in the context of web design. So all of your links and everything are relative to that directory. Inside that directory, there's a couple of pieces of content that you want to have in every website. The primary thing is your index.html. So that's going to be the home page. It always needs to be index.html. Again, if you've taken any server classes, you understand that the web server is going to look for that index.html first. And so we need to provide that so that it knows which is the kind of the home page in that directory. You may have other HTML files as we get into our later projects. You're going to have your subpages that are something.html, but the one we need to have is that index.html. You're also going to have a style sheet, something.css. Now you can name that anything related to your website. Some people like to name it style.css. You may use the name of your website.css, something that makes sense to you as the designer. Then there's two additional folders that you need to have, and possibly one more, depending on your design. The primary one that you need is an images folder. Now don't confuse this with the folder where you're keeping all of your in-progress files. That's actually the other thing that we need in there, which is a working files folder or something to keep our in-progress, our Photoshop files, all of our research files, anything that we've got that we've downloaded that's associated with the design but not production. So for production, we want to move all of the images that we're using for production out of that directory into our images directory that's in the root folder, so that you've kind of separated your in-progress files from your final production files. So those are the last two that are kind of required, which is the images directory and the working files directory. Now, that working files directory can have its own folder structure underneath it to help you organize your Photoshop files and your potentially used files and the ones you've selected as your final files in your Photoshop design. So keeping yourself organized under there is up to you, but a good idea. The last folder that you may or may not have, depending on your design, is the fonts folder. Now, that fonts folder is going to consistently contain any web fonts that you've created or you've used in your design. So you may have, if you've used a font that you want to create as a web font and use as a web font in your design in the HTML through like fontsquirrel.com. Again, we covered that in the video lecture. But if you're using a font from fontsquirrel.com, your final production web fontized fonts will be in that fonts folder. And that's kind of the last piece that you should see in that home directory. Now, if you have videos on your website, you may end up creating a videos folder or something like that. But the point is to keep yourself organized, and at a minimum, you should have those kind of four components: the index.html, the style.css or something.css, your images folder where your production images go, and your working files folder where all your in-progress stuff goes. That keeps you well organized. If you need to go back and find your Photoshop file for a specific design later on, you know exactly where that file is. I can't stress enough how critical keeping yourself organized, especially when you're dealing with multiple projects, maybe in a freelance environment across dozens of clients. So that's extremely useful to your workflow.